Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back to Washington Journal. We're joined now to talk about the bail system and reforms to the bail system with Lisel Petis. She is a resident senior fellow for criminal justice and civil liberties at the R Street Institute. Lisel, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So first, tell us about the R Street Institute and how you're funded and if you have a political slant.
So the R Street Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. We do focus on free markets and limited effective government. So often we are working with right of center sides, as well as key stakeholders in the criminal justice system. We are funded by a variety of philanthropic foundations, organizations, and individuals that support the work we do.
Well, so explain to us how the pretrial system works in the U.S. and what's the purpose of bail?
It's kind of hard to just say how it works because it actually works differently across the country. Every state has a different pretrial system and different pretrial laws. However, kind of the common factor is when somebody commits offense, they are arrested or cited. Bail only comes in if the person is arrested. If they're arrested, they essentially come into the system and a bail amount may be set. In some states, there's going to be a determination if the person gets bail at all or if they're going to just be held in custody. But if they are going to be released, there will be conditions of bail. Those could be monetary, often referred to as cash bail, which people hear about a lot, or conditions such as house arrest, supervision. It could be drug testing. Once that person is out, then they really have to abide by the rules. They have to show up for court. They can't get new offenses. They have to abide by the conditions that have been imposed. And if they have, they'll be successful. And if not, they could actually face getting rearrested and put back into jail. But again, that looks differently across the states.
And how is that decision made to set a bond? Is there certain criteria that a judge goes through? How does that work?
So a judge will generally be focused on two main areas, which is public safety and whether or not somebody will appear back in court. Those are kind of two big considerations, although I should say not every state evaluates both of those. For example, New York does not actually consider somebody's dangerousness. They only consider somebody appearing back in court. But those are kind of the two main considerations. After that, generally the state's laws are going to give kind of a laundry list of factors to be considered. It could be the level of the offense. It could be prior criminal history. It could be access to cash. And they'll kind of evaluate all those, but really looking how those then play into whether or not somebody is a flight or safety risk.
And what are the issues that you think need reforming in the bail bond system?
I would say, the biggest issue with the cash bail system is really at both ends of the spectrum. So at the one end of the spectrum, you have individuals who have been accused of kind of these lower level offenses, maybe driving under restraint, simple theft, things of that nature, who are low risk, very likely to show up for court, stay law abiding, but they can't even afford really low levels of bail amount. You look at a place like Michigan, who had a report a couple years ago saying that 38% of their pretrial detainees were being held there on a bail amount of less than $2,500. When working with a bail bondsman, you usually only pay about 10% of that. So we're talking about people being held on $250 really at the end of the day. So that's kind of the one issue is, are we best using our resources by having people staying in jail for these low-level offenses that are low risk? On the other end of the spectrum, you have individuals who may have committed very serious crimes. They may be high risk for fleeing or for danger to the community. And yet, if they have the financial means, if you set a high cash bail amount, they could still pay their way out. So that is really more being determined on wealth versus a risk to society. And I would say that's really the number one issue with the cash bail system. Proponents of bail reform also will really point to more long-term unintended consequences. So oftentimes we just think about pretrial detention in that one moment right after the arrest and somebody's being detained. But research has shown that when individuals are arrested, even for one day or two, that can start to kind of create this succession of collateral consequences. Somebody might lose a job, they may lose housing, they could have the custody of their children challenged. And when those things start happening, it actually creates a higher likelihood of reoffending in the future. And so can actually compromise public safety on the back end. It's generally only those, again, lower level offenses. We're not talking about the violent felonies. But that's certainly a concern for a lot of proponents of bail reform.
And we will take your calls for about the next 35 minutes with our guest, Lisel Petis, on the bail system. We are dividing the lines this time by region. So if you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, call us on 202-748-8000. If you're in Mountain or Pacific, it's 202-748-8001. Also, we have a line if you have had any experience with the bail system. You can call us on 202-748-8002. You can also use our line for texting and our social media lines. Lisel, can you give us a little bit of an idea of the history of the bail system? Where did it come from? For what purpose? And around when did it start?
So the bail system has been around for centuries. We're talking about before America, back when we were looking in Europe, and really it was a way to work within the judicial system to make sure that people were being held accountable, that people were showing up to court, that they were facing the charges against them. Over time, public safety really became a concern as well. So that wasn't an original piece of the bail system, but certainly has become a very prominent piece of the bail system now. The idea is that, especially once we came into America, under our Constitution, we have certain rights. One is the presumption of innocence. So we don't want to just lock up everybody accused of a crime. We want to make sure that we're locking up people who may be not showing up to face those charges, or, potentially locking up people who may be a safety risk for our communities. But the vast majority of people actually show up for court and stay law-abiding. And those individuals do have a presumption of innocence. We don't know if they're guilty of the crime that they've been accused of. And it's not a great use of taxpayer money to be holding them in a jail if they are going to be coming into court anyways, and they are going to be staying law-abiding. And as we've progressed forward, we have started to see cash bail being used. So at first it was being held or released. Fairly early on, cash came into play about whether or not somebody could essentially pay to get out. The theory was really that if somebody had some skin in the game, that they would show back up for court because they want that money back. Kind of early in the 1900s, we really started to see bail bonds come about. They came about before that, but that's really when they became more prominent. And a bail bondsman is somebody who is going to pay the cash bail amount for somebody to be released. And in return, the defendant will pay generally between 10 to 15% of that bond amount as a non-refundable bond amount. And what that means is that the bail bondsman gets to keep that money and be that surety for the rest of the amount to the court.
Even if they show up, though?
If they show up, a lot of times the courts will wait to see whether or not the person shows up. So oftentimes the bail amount is not having to be paid in. And like I said, the vast majority of people do show up for court. The bail amount from the defendant to the bail bondsman is not refundable whether they show up for court or not.
So they keep that as profit for their services.
Correct.
I wanted to ask you have a I just wanted to let people know that your report on this is called Tools for Safe and Smart Bail System Changes. It's at rstreet.org, so people can take a look at that if they would like. But critics of bail reform, Lisel, say that it's going to increase crime, increase violent crime. Is there any evidence that shows the relationship between bail reform and violent crime?
So there is no evidence that shows a direct correlation that bail reform causes violent crime. However, this concern comes up a lot, so I think it's still worth addressing kind of where that concern comes from. We see a lot of cases in the media where somebody has gotten out on release and something tragic happens. There was one just recently in the news this week. And I think what's really important to remember is that bail reform has looked very different state to state. So when we kind of group it all together and say bail reform causes violent crime, it's very hard to unpack that because there is no one bail reform effort. What has been done in New Jersey looks very different than what has been done in New York, which looks very different than what's been done in Illinois. And so we really have to kind of look at the very specific local level of what's happening. So I'll give an example. In the state of New York, their bail reform had a couple things. First, it's important to mention again that New York does not consider dangerousness in their bail determinations. That is very different. Most every other state does consider dangerousness. New York does not. So
But why is that, Liesel? That seems odd. I mean, wouldn't that be the most important thing?
well, like I said, the original purpose of bail from history is to have people show up for court, and that is New York's main consideration when they do their bail determinations. A lot of other states have prioritized public safety. There's a couple states that actually say that is the main and primary concern is public safety, but not every state has done that. Um, the other things that New York has done for bail reform is, and this has been amended several times over the last couple of years, but requiring certain people to be out on release. So some bail reform actually is a presumption of release. So the person is presumed to be released unless there's a flight or safety risk. New York has made a long list of crimes that it is a mandatory release. So you got to kind of compare that to something like New Jersey. New Jersey had a very different approach to bail reform. Their approach was not only essentially getting rid of cash bail for most offenses, but they also greatly expanded preventative detention. And preventative detention means that somebody doesn't have a right to be released on bail. They would just remain in jail rather than be released. They also had a robust pretrial services program put in place at the same time. So they're very different efforts and laws, and so it's hard to compare just bail reform in general and a rise in crime. But I will say, as of right now, I'm not aware of any studies that show that there is a direct relation between bail reform and a rise in crime.
But Liesel, if we were to compare those two states, New York and New Jersey, who are border states, obviously, and have very different views on pretrial detention and release, what are the different crime rates? I mean, is that a fair comparison to see which method is better?
I think it is worth looking at the crime rates. I think a better method is looking at whether or not the people being released from jail are showing up for court and staying law abiding, because crime rates can be affected by so many things. We saw huge spikes in crime after the closures from COVID, after the murder of George Floyd. I mean, those are external kind of things that are then impacting the criminal justice system and this rise in crime. So it's very hard to use that as one indicator of success. I do think it's something to be looked at. New Jersey did, in fact, and has continued to see that the people that they have released in their systems do continue to show up for court, and they've had very low levels of people getting out and committing serious offenses. They also have had a decrease in crime overall since bail reform. And so I think all those are kind of indicators to show whether or not there's been success. New York has had different kind of studies come out about whether or not there's been success or not. And it's, again, just very nuanced because a lot has happened in New York in the criminal justice space over the last several years.
And we will take your calls for our guest, Lisel Petis, on our lines by region. Eastern or Central time zones, it's 202-748-8000. Mountain Pacific, it's 202-748-8001. If you've had experience with the bail system, it is 202-748-8002. Before we go to the phones, Lisel, I just want to ask you about this article about Illinois from CBS. It says Illinois becomes the first state to end cash bail. That article was in September of last year. So I'm wondering, once they have ended cash bail, what impact has that had?
I think all of us, that's the big question. What Illinois did is absolutely groundbreaking. While we've had a lot of other states and municipalities really pull back on their use of cash bail, Illinois is the first place across the nation that has full-on eliminated cash bail. At the same time that they did that, they did expand the list, kind of like New Jersey did, of offenses that could be preventively detained instead. But now in the state of Illinois, the options are you will be detained or released. And if released, the conditions cannot be monetary. So you are getting out. It's just a matter of what conditions are in there as well. We are about 6 months out, I think, from the implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act, which eliminated cash bail. People are gathering evidence and facts to see really how impactful it's been. I know there's recently been studies that it has reduced the jail populations, which was one of the goals or anticipated outcomes of this. We are still waiting to see the full data on whether or not crime rates have changed, or, like I said, even more importantly, if the people being released are in fact showing up for court and if they're staying law-abiding. The one thing we do know is a lot of critics of pretrial fairness were concerned about kind of the purge happening after it was implemented, meaning that people would just go out and commit all the crimes and think there was no consequences. That definitely did not happen. It seems that most of the key stakeholders and the professionals in the criminal justice system, they may want some tweaks still with what's going on, but many think that it's going okay, that there isn't this huge severe outcome from it.
All right, well, let's hear from callers. Robert is up first in Silver Spring, Maryland. Good morning.
Yes, it seems like a lot of our large cities are actually experiencing a purge. The Chicago man who was released this week and then murdered a child within 24 hours, the New York punching rampage where the people are not even being arrested. D.C. this week, a dispensary worker was murdered after complying and giving up the products. We had a group of people who killed a homeless man, people walking around on the street with semi-automatic rifles. None of these people are arrested. The complete acceptance of crime, it has to stop. We have to go back to law and order, and it's really insulting to the people that are following the laws. So that's basically my comment, and that's why we'll be supporting Trump in the fall.
Lisel.
There's a couple things to unpack there. I think one of the things we first need to remember is there have been some absolutely tragic cases out there. Some of these individuals, I couldn't hear all the examples, but some of them I do believe were actually released on parole, which means that they had been convicted of a crime and released out of the jail or prison sentence. And that discussion of parole, probation, and sentencing will have to be for a different day. But certainly we've seen tragedies when people are released on bail as well. I think one thing that's important just to remember is that people under the cash bail system often are released as well. Many people do get out of jail on cash bail, whether it's by their own means, a family member's means, or more often than not, a bail bondsman who's paying that amount for them to get out. So these tragedies, unfortunately, may or may not happen under each system. But always when we see these tragic things happen, it's completely fair to evaluate what the system is doing and is there a better way to do it. And that could mean, changing policies, but more often than not, it might just mean changing practices and how the policies are being used in the courtrooms, and using some of the tools that are already available.
All right, another Robert, this time in Gulfport, Mississippi. Good morning, Robert.
Yes, ma'am. I'm kind of piggybacking on the last gentleman. I think the laws have been, I guess you could say, dumbed down so much that there's no penalty now for the crimes. They go in, they get a little bail or maybe no bail, and they're back on the streets. And the judges, now in certain states, you can steal $1,000 and there's no big deal. I don't even think you get arrested. So, something's got to be done. If you do the crime, I think they need to do the time. And especially, you see now, as the other gentleman was saying, everyone that is committing a lot of, or not everyone, but most of the people that are committing these crimes are either out on bail or they have X number of violent crimes in their past and they're out of jail. Some of them have over 20, like over a period of the last 14 years, they've been in jail 20 times. Now, why is that person on the street committing crimes? That's sort of the angle that I'm trying to ask about. Thank you.
We have to be really careful when we're talking about punishment. When we're talking about pretrial detention, these individuals have not been convicted of a crime. They've been accused, and under our Constitution and the laws of the United States, they are presumed innocent. They have a right to due process, a right to have a jury convict them of that crime before facing punishment. So we do have to be careful. The pretrial detention determination or bail determination, it does reflect, or like I said, not all states, but most states do consider public safety. But that is very different than saying somebody deserves to be punished at this point in time. And so judges have to really take what's before them and say, is this person going to get out and be dangerous to society? Are they not going to show up for court? And those are the things that they're going to be considering. The caller mentioned like there's some cases where people have, 20 prior arrests. I understand the concern. I'm not in those courtrooms making those decisions, so it's unclear to me when, what the decision was to be released. But again, I would just say we have to remember that even under a cash bail system, those individuals often are paying to get out. One interesting that's come out of Illinois is that some victim representatives have said that eliminating cash bail has actually made victims safer under this new system, because now instead of somebody having the right to pay to get out, they are just being detained in some of those cases where there's high risk defendants. So it's actually, in some ways, you got to be thoughtful of how you're doing bail reform. It can actually create more safety.
Let's talk to Ed in Queens, New York. Hi, Ed.
Good morning, Mimi. Hello again. And hello, Lisel. My TV is muted again, too. Okay. All right. My experience has been that the bail system here in New York was run through too fast. It started with keeping someone in custody for more than 2 years in solitary confinement, punitive segregation, on suspicion of stealing a school bag. When he was released a few months afterwards, he killed himself. And that's what started the bail system. I'm a little bit familiar with it because I was tasked with writing the training program for it, and there really was not enough time to get it done. And I had to teach officers some very simple things, such as 30 days have September, April, June, and November, so they knew how to calculate when to release people into society. So this is what started the bail program in New York City Department of Correction. And as I said, it was way too short a time to initiate a comprehensive training program, mainly because a lot of people don't know that training takes a great deal more time than they think. So basically that's my experience with what happened there.
Thanks for the input. Lisel, any comment on that?
Yeah, I would say I am familiar with that case, and a lot of policies, especially in the criminal justice space, are a result of a very tragic instance, kind of as the one that was just told. And so you see that happen a lot on both sides of the aisle, whether it's kind of creating these more tough on crime laws or creating these reforms. I also completely agree with the caller that too often we're pushing through criminal justice policies without doing all of our due diligence. And, some of the better policies that come about, what we see is a collaboration with all stakeholders. You want to make sure that prosecutors are at the table talking about these changes. You want police at the table talking about these changes. And just as much, you want people who've been in the system to be talking about these changes. It doesn't mean everybody has to agree, but it needs to all be considered so that, you are figuring out the holes, you're figuring out the training pieces. I know Illinois, again, like New York, has had to make amendments to their bail reform and are continuing to have conversations of, are there changes that need to be made to make it stronger? And I think that is the more you can do before the policy is put in place to try and avoid some of those unintended consequences is great.
Pensacola, Florida is next. Pat, hello.
Yes, I have a comment to make for Ms. Pettis. Is the way you solve the bail problem, if you think it's wrong for certain people who can't afford it, is if they don't do the crime, they won't have to. Yeah, I'd like to make a comment about the bail reform.
We heard you. You're saying if they didn't do the crime, then they wouldn't have to afford bail in the first place.
Yeah, that's the one point. The other point is on crime statistics. If these liberal DAs downgrade charges from felonies to misdemeanors, that would also affect the reporting on crime statistics. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the reporting piece, and we have another colleague on our team that could probably answer that better, so I'm going to leave that one. But going to, if they don't commit the crimes, they're not going to have to worry about this. I have to keep reiterating just that these are individuals who are presumed to be innocent at that point in time. I am passionate also about crime prevention. We do work in making sure that crimes don't happen in the first place and finding the best practices to ensure that behavior stops. But really, we are talking about people who are presumed to be innocent. They have not been accused of the crime. So it's just a very different determination when we're talking about pretrial versus post-conviction after somebody's been accused and convicted.
And Lisel, the state of Georgia has, last month, the state Senate approved a bill that if it passed, it would expand the list of offenses that require cash bail, so kind of going in the opposite direction of Illinois. What are your thoughts on that? Tell us exactly what's happening and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? We have Illinois, who has decided to completely eliminate cash bail, and then you have Georgia, who has greatly expanded their list of offenses that are now being required to have cash bail. And I'm emphasizing the required because what that means is that judges and prosecutors no longer have any discretion in those offenses. And we're talking pretty long list of offenses that are more than just violent crimes. Possession of marijuana is in there. A second reckless driving charge is in there. Some of these still serious offenses that people should be held accountable for, but aren't generally seen for that kind of cash bail consideration in many places. So right now it has passed through the legislature and is waiting on the governor's desk. I know that people who are against the bill are very concerned about just some of the again, unintended consequences of when we pass policies and don't think through all of how it's going to impact the system. So the state of Georgia is already seeing backlogged courts. They're seeing jails that are overwhelmed, just having way too many people in there, and this certainly could add to that problem, making it even worse, and certainly taking the discretion completely away from your judges and prosecutors who really have the expertise and knowledge to know what to do with these cases is concerning. So, and if anything, it's really just going back to that. They weren't addressing the risk, saying if people are high risk, this is the concern, and what can we do about it? It really became back down to wealth. What's the cash amount that we can attach to these offenses? And it is a very long list.
And Keith is calling us from Denver, Colorado. Hi, Keith.
Hi. Good morning, Lisel. I am so impressed by your presentation of facts this morning. Thank you for bringing some much-needed context and perspective to this discussion. Understanding that our street is center-right, I think you're doing a great deal to counter a lot of the what I'll describe as false narratives that exist around this issue. And to be quite honest, it runs on loop on Fox News 24/7 a day. So if we look at the incident with Diller in New York, for instance, the officer, which was purely political, right? It was an awful tragedy what happened to the officer. I think it's important to keep informing people that even though this may be their steady diet of news consumption, I call it news very loosely, on Fox News. I watched Fox News this morning. It's on a loop. They're in New York talking about Diller. That's a week-long story. They've been asked not to talk about Lakeland Riley by Lakeland Riley's family. I will try to speed up here. But all of this crime is down significantly from 2020. I mean, all the statistics.
All right. Lisel, any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say our street really tries to take politics out of what we do. We really focus on policy. We follow the research, the studies, and really just try and say, you know, what makes the most common sense here, and apply that. Again, the Diller story is absolutely tragic. I look at the kind of history of those defendants and have my own questions. But the purpose of bail is really to be focused on how do we keep our community safe? How do we best use our taxpayer dollars, and make sure that the system is being fairly applied to everybody?
So Truthsayer sends you this on X. I would think linking bail to public safety should be the most important concern. I am dumbfounded that New York doesn't see it that way. So Lisel, I mean, is there pressure on New York to change that? Is there talk of reforming that?
You know, a couple of years ago, I know there was a lot of pressure and a lot of conversations in the state of New York on that. I'm not going to speak for the state. I will also say that the state of New York is not the only state that puts more emphasis on appearing in court than public safety. I did just put out a paper on comparing all 50 states' bail laws. So if people are interested in kind of looking at state to state and what they are actually using to determine bail, they certainly can go to our street's website to access that. But you are seeing on the other side, there are states who have not just said we're addressing public safety, but have actually said that this is a primary purpose for bail is public safety. So we're seeing both sides. Again, can't speak for the state of New York, but I believe it's an ongoing discussion.
Granby, Colorado. Tom, good morning.
Hey, good morning. Right quick, I've got to get ready and go to work. But the idea is we've got to do something to get the private citizen back out there on top. We can't spend more time taking care of the criminals than we do the victims. When you do, you undermine the entire society. There's no answer, and I hate to be so blunt about this, but guys like me are not being paid to solve that problem. Unfortunately, the guys at the top are being paid to solve that, and they're not doing a very good job. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Let's go to Bruce in Canton, Massachusetts. Hi, Bruce.
Yeah, good morning. This is a very timely discussion. My own experience is very limited with the bail system, but at least in Massachusetts, I think that it's reasonably corrupt in that about 12 years ago, my piano coach, I'm a physician, but I play in piano competitions. So my piano coach calls me at around 11 o'clock at night. He was arrested, and can I bail him out? He had had a fight with his boyfriend. The apartment building has thin walls, and a neighbor called the police, and he got arrested. He says it's $1,800. So I pull together $1,800, go to the ATM, get the cash, go down to the jail, where I discover that I have a choice. I can pay a bail bondsman $180 and get him out now, or I can wait until 10 a.m. Monday morning, this is Saturday night, and put the $1,800 up at the court clerk.
So what did you do, Bruce?
I don't want him to stay in jail a day and a half. Well, I paid the $180. The case was actually dismissed around 4 months later, but he later told me that part of his conditions of release were drug testing, even though there were no drugs involved. And it cost him another $1,000 for mandatory drug testing. So it seemed like, and there were a lot of people waiting there to bail out their loved ones, their family, their friends. and it was just a system to funnel money. There was no chance that he wasn't going to show for trial. And
all right, well, let's get a response from Lisel.
Yeah, bail is done very differently in every single, again, not just state, but city. So, the procedures that you just talked about are going to change and be different state to state. It is concerning, certainly, to hear that you can pay one amount, get released immediately, and not the other. Certainly, one of the pushes when people are talking about changing bail systems is how do we make sure that people who are going to be released can be released immediately, so they're not facing those collateral consequences of losing a job or a house or other pieces. So the swiftness of getting somebody the decision that's already going to be made quicker is really a push as well.
And our former caller was talking about the crime rate and how much it is reported on media outlets. This is NBC News that says the U.S. crime rate is still dropping. FBI data shows. It says that one expert is saying that people confuse disorder with crime. So I wonder what you make of that and how that perception of crime, even though it is actually going down, is impacting the bail reform movement.
I think it's a very valid point. And Georgia is actually a great example. The state of Georgia has seen a decrease in crime. Atlanta's actually seen bigger drops than they have in history. So we know that the actual stats of what's going on with crime rates doesn't always immediately impact policy in the way we think it would. A couple of things playing into that is, yes, pretty much across the nation, crime rates are going down. However, polls are showing that most Americans think that crime is worsening. So the perception and reality are not linking up right now, which I think is driving some policy. But certainly kind of this disorder or chaos that the writer was speaking about is out there. And what I mean by that is that we are seeing a very high level of mental health crisis in the public. Overdoses and drug use, especially fentanyl, has obviously been a crisis across the nation, and homelessness encampments. And when people see these other pieces of behavioral health crisis, homelessness, they often connect it with crime, which we really can't do because they are distinct and separate and different. But that when people see that, they think crime. And so it is not quite as surprising that the perception is that crime is worsening when we're seeing those pieces, even though the stats themselves are going down in most places.
And Bill, in Venice, Florida, good morning.
Good morning. Some points. The term crime is used a great deal, and what you just touched on is real important. The way to keep people away from prison is not to arrest them if there's no crime. And my take on that is no victim, no crime. I don't know what the percentage is, but I think it's pretty high of people winding up in jail where there's no victim. So I wonder if you could address that and the importance of that, of not getting them in the system to begin with. Thank you.
And Bill, can you explain what you mean by like no victim, no crime? Like, give me an example.
A true crime is when somebody, if there's theft involved or the person is hurt. So we used to have what was called the vice squad. Okay, so back even then they caused crime was either prostitution, gambling, or narcotics, and there's no victim there. So if we got rid of those and maybe help people like you also mentioned homeless and things like that, there's no crime there. They need some help.
Go ahead, Lisel.
I certainly understand the caller's concerns. I mean, too often jails are turning into these de facto mental health facilities, homeless shelters, detox centers, which is not great use of taxpayer money. It's unfair to the deputies that are having to deal with it. So I understand where the concern comes from. I would say that we have to be a little bit careful of making that much of a difference in how we use the language. The first thing that comes to me is a DUI or driving under intoxication. I would say that's probably a quote unquote victimless crime if they haven't hit anybody. but we generally want those people to be prosecuted because it could become a tragedy. So I think it's just tough saying one should or should not be arrested or not. I think that's why you see states like New Jersey who have really opened up detention to most crimes, but making sure that it's very focused on whether or not somebody is a danger or a flight risk versus, just the offense itself.
Let's talk to Dave next in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania.
Hi. My question is, what makes you think that your perception of reality, which does not include crime, is the only perspective that's correct? Because most of us perceive crime to be out of control, everything in this country to be out of control. Every single state is allowing these criminals out. What just happened in New York? Cop got killed. Did the guy get out? When are you going to understand that your perception could be the wrong perception and that reality is what the other half thinks is to be truth, is actually the truth, and you are wrong?
All right, Dave. What do you think, Lisel?
Well, I'll say I will disagree in the thought that I don't think that crime is okay. Like I said, our street does focus on how do we actually reduce crime, how do we prevent crime. Any amount of crime I think is unacceptable, and we should be working to really resolve it. One interesting thing, though, I want to point out is that the polls that I was kind of referencing earlier, where people say that crime is worsening, even though we see data going the other way, is that when individuals were asked about crime in their local area versus crime in the nation, most people think crime in the nation is very serious and bad. It's gotten to a bad point, but locally, they don't think so, which that makes, I can't say for sure, but it makes me think that most people are basing their perception of crime off what we're seeing in the news and the media, and not what they're actually experiencing locally. Again, people are experiencing crime. I come from a background in representing victims. I am fiercely fighting against more crime, but again, we're talking about people who've been accused. They have not been convicted, and whether or not they should be detained or released, and what the consequences and the trade-offs are if they are detained or released. There is no perfect solution. There is no right or wrong answer, but we need to be evaluating all the tools that are available and looking for the best option.
Okay, one more call. Steve in Portland, Oregon. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Your crime statistics are not correct. We have so many of these large liberal cities not even reporting crime to the FBI, so the statistics are low. Also, you don't take into account that they let people walk out of these stores with merchandise that are never even arrested, so there are no statistics on that. I've seen it happen. They walk out of a store, they have people at the door. I said, you just let them walk out with racks of goods? And they said, yeah, we're told not to stop them. Yet I feel like a fool. My wife's in line at the cash register to pay over $400 for merchandise. So the statistics are not correct.
Lisel, I know you addressed reporting, but anything you'd like to add?
I just want to say the caller makes fair comments. We actually had, I think it was 83% of law enforcement agencies did report to the FBI this year, but last year it was, less than 50%, and it can skew data, and I think that is a fair thing to point out. However, this year there's more reporting and crime did go down. I also will say, if we're not arresting people, that is also going to skew data, and that I cannot speak for on this call because we're talking about bail specifically, but certainly clearance rates for crimes that are being committed, making sure that police are out there and are properly funded to make arrests is also an important discussion to be having.
All right. Resident Senior Fellow for Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at the R Street Institute, Lisel Petis. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And later on Washington Journal, we'll talk to Ipsos Public Affairs President Cliff Young to discuss public attitudes toward campaign 2024, the candidates, and top issues. But first, we will go back to our question from this morning. What is your top news story of the week? We will take your questions. The numbers are on your screen. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Republicans, 202-748-8001. And Independents, 202-748-8002. We'll be right back.